Hi, this is Lex, and welcome to the Fintech Blueprint. It's your podcast about fintech, decentralized finance, digital banking, investing, robo-advice, artificial intelligence, and all the other frontier technology that is transforming financial services. To get more content, like an illustrated transcript of this conversation in your inbox, subscribe at fintechblueprint.com. So without further delay, let's jump into today's episode. Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's conversation. I'm absolutely thrilled to have with us today Jayendra Jog, who is the co-founder of Sei Labs. Sei Labs is behind the Sei protocol, which is one of the fastest parallel blockchains in the market, if not the fastest one, and is being deployed with a large ecosystem and a set of really interesting financial institutions. So I'm excited to learn more about Sei, as well as to learn from Jay about his professional experience. With that, Jay, welcome to the conversation.
Good morning. Good morning. Thanks for having me on, Lex.
Absolutely. So your career kind of went pretty much straight into tech and entrepreneurship. Can you tell us about, just the first baby steps that you took towards tech, and what were those experiences like?
I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and as you can imagine, you're surrounded by tech companies all the time. All of your friends are working at tech companies, or your friends' parents are working at tech companies. Everything around you is kind of tied to tech. So I wanted to be kind of doing something in tech by the time I was in elementary school, honestly. I started learning how to code in high school. So I took the San Jose State University online kind of intro to CS class. And I realized that, it's actually a ton of fun. So then I ended up going to college to study computer science. And while I was at college, I explored working at a lot of different types of companies. I worked at a bigger company. I worked at SAP, which is like a massive company. And I realized, wait a minute, it doesn't feel that satisfying to just be working on something that candidly wasn't even that important for the company's success. Then afterwards, I moved a magnitude smaller. I worked at Facebook, and I'm like, okay, this is better, but it's still not that level where I'm kind of making the impact that I want to make.
Facebook is known to be a tiny company.
Yeah, when I was there were some people that had been there back when it was tiny, but by the time I joined in 2016, this was post-IPO. This is already when it was quite large. So I'm like, okay, let's go a step smaller. And that's when I actually was a Kleiner Perkins fellow. I don't know how well known that fellowship is anymore, but back then it was, honestly, extremely difficult to get into. And it allowed you to work for one of the portfolio companies, which in my case was Pinterest. And Pinterest, this was a pre-IPO company, not too big at the time. And the work that I was doing was just very, very impactful. Impactful in the sense that it actually moved the business metrics. If I wasn't there, then there'd be someone else that was working on it. Whereas at the other places I'd been at, if I wasn't there, it was just an intern project. No one really gave a shit whether it got worked on or not. So I'm like, okay, this type of environment is a much better fit for me. And I realized that in terms of looking for career opportunities, there were a couple of things that really mattered to me personally. The first is surrounding myself with people that I considered better than me. I think that's really the only good way to grow. I've talked to more new grads recently, and they're just trying to optimize for getting the highest possible salary. And I think that that's a recipe for disaster. Yes, you will in the short term make more money from that, but I think in the long term, you really stifle your learning. And as a result of that, you stifle both your career growth and then also your financial trajectory. So even if you're getting paid less money, I think it makes sense to join the company that's going to help you be surrounded by more talented people. And then the second thing that I realized about myself is I just want to go as small as possible in terms of company size, because the smaller it is, the more growth opportunities you have. And from a financial standpoint as well, that's the more risk you're taking on, therefore the more upside in theory that you should have. So 2017, there was this event called the Greylock Tech Fair happening in San Francisco. I don't know if they still have that, but it was basically this invite-only career fair. So they only picked 200-300 students to show up. And they had all their portfolio companies there. There was only one company with the line at that time. They had maybe 100 companies there. They'd rented out, back then I think it was called, AT&T Stadium. And there was just one company with the line. And that company back then was Robinhood. So I didn't really know much about it, but it was kind of this mimetic effect where all these talented people were interested in working at this company. And I'm like, okay, I have to learn more about this. So back then, Robinhood was basically just two houses across the street from one another back in 2017. And in one of the houses, they basically took the bedrooms and they put up standing desks over there. But that's where like the engineering teams were working from. Like it was a really scrappy operation back in 2017. So I'm like, okay, I mean, this seems like an environment where I can learn a lot. And I mean, at that time, my competing opportunities were like working at Pinterest again or staying in school for 5 years to get a master's. And I was like, I'm just going to go ahead, kind of full send it, see what happens. And I think in hindsight, that was absolutely the best decision out of those three for me. I don't think I really would have grown much at Pinterest. I don't think I really needed to get a master's in CS after already getting a bachelor's in CS. And I think the kind of people that I was surrounded with at Robinhood were, I mean, they were just insanely good. And it's looking back at it now, I think out of my new grad class, around a third of the people in that class, so it's something like 9 out of like 25 or something, they've started venture-backed companies, like from Silicon Valley VC firms. And I think that kind of talent density is really, really difficult to find at most places. So in hindsight, I think that was absolutely the right decision.
How many people were at Robinhood when you joined?
So when I interviewed, it was around 80 to 90 people. By the time I joined, it was around 200 to 250. So it was not like a tiny, tiny startup, but it was still small enough where like every single project I worked on, like moved the business metrics a shitload. And it was also small enough where I got to see 10x, where by the time I left, like I stayed there for 3.5 years, I was not only like one of the most tenured people at the org, but also there had just been so much growth happening around me that I was able to play a very meaningful role in terms of onboarding people, in terms of like helping scale the team and getting more involved in the management side as well.
Can you tell me about that scaling at Robinhood? As a fintech company, Robinhood is obviously a huge success. It played extremely well into the change in social culture towards much more sort of self-directed trading and risk-taking. It's really transformed sort of the role of market makers in the equities markets. It was one of the first brokers to add crypto trading, and it was a successful IPO and a great example of a fintech company that stuck to its roots and the things it believed in. Whether or not you agree with sort of the importance of trading is separate, but like it did what it was meant to do. Can you walk us through like what that scale up felt like? And in particular, like I'm really interested in, were there organizational design issues that kind of fell apart or that had to be rebuilt? Was there like a different approach to running teams as it became bigger? Were there like things you had to change and to keep the culture fast and high performance? Like, can you talk about that experience?
Yeah, so I'll caveat this by saying that I was a new grad engineer who then transformed into an engineering lead. So I have much more of that perspective as an engineer, not the perspective that Vlad would have in terms of looking at everything from the top. But from my perspective, when I joined, everything had been built largely for the sake of getting to a working MVP. So, I mean, when they got started building Robinhood, I don't think they were expecting it to be as successful as it had become even by that time. And I think that's absolutely the right mindset to have, where you start off building things in a very scrappy way. You build MVPs. You don't really care as much about things like code quality or things like making it super like robust, extensible for the future. And I mean, honestly, if you care about that stuff super early on as a startup, you're burning time. It obviously takes more time to build things in like the cleanest possible way. You're burning time that you could be using to get distribution and to get user feedback. So I don't fault them at all for that. But it was kind of just in many ways, a mess internally. And my time over there was spent, I mean, first of all, on building new products with kind of that similar mindset where it's like, we're scrappy, very pre-IPO. We need to like just get this stuff out there. And then I started noticing a transition. This transition happened around 2019 timeframe, 2019, 2020, when we just started having a bunch of incidents in production. Like it was just like pure technology incidents that were tied to things not being built in the best way. And these were like very meaningful issues for the business. I won't go into the types of SEVs that we saw, but I'll just say that some of them could have been very existential. And we, in many ways, got lucky around that. And I think that after going through that, leadership was like, okay, we need to build things in a maintainable way moving forward. So there became much more of a push to get things ready to be kind of the long-term types of things that are built in a clean way that will be able to ideally handle the kind of scale that we're seeing. And I think at this point, it seems like those initiatives have been largely successful. But I think back then when I was there, even when I left by the time in 2021, it still felt like there was a lot of work to be done over there. The second part that I'll mention is around people. When I joined, it felt like everyone was largely a missionary. The offers that most people got to join Robinhood were less than the offers they had from other places that they'd be interviewing at. So even in my case, I turned down like a pretty large signing bonus from Pinterest to join Robinhood. And I was making a very conscious financial decision to accept less money for just being surrounded by a ton of talented people. And I think when you get people like that to join an organization where they're basically not just accepting the highest salary that they're getting, they're picking a company for some broader reason. I think they tend to be much more bought into what's happening, and they tend to be just working harder and like kind of giving more of a shit. As the company started to scale, and especially as we got to the 2020, 2021 timeframe, I noticed that there was a shift towards, basically getting like people that are, in my view, kind of like traditional FANG type of employees. And what I mean by that is they're not necessarily in it for like that missionary mindset of like ownership or like having some kind of big impact. It's more just like trying to earn money to like just working a 9 to 5 to focus on whatever else there is in life. And I think that really resulted in a few things changing. Like, first of all, I think our product velocity changed quite a bit from that because people were just more checked out. And I think the second thing that I noticed was that when you bring in these like career FANG type of employees, they tend to be a lot more political. So it becomes much more of a focus on kingdom building for like management. Like instead of just focusing on getting product shipped, they focus on their own career success. So they focus on hiring as many people as possible under them so that they're able to justify getting promoted from like VP to senior VP or something. And it becomes more of this like internal political game instead of just focusing on the product and the mission. So I feel like we scaled way too aggressively at that time. And I think that there were like a lot of things just kind of slowed down because of that. I think at this point, it seems like from the outside looking into Robinhood, they've been able to improve a lot of that. And the company seems to be at a much better spot now than it was back when I left in 2021.
The growing pains of a company often is actually where things completely fall apart. And it's quite rare for founders and teams to be able to navigate that transition. You need to have a good economic engine to actually do that. If you're going through that growing pain, but you don't have a business model that works, it's like the square of the problem it's so much worse. The last question about Robinhood for you is, if you look back on some of the technical problems that you worked on, whether they were markets related or scalability related or things that you saw, what were your takeaways about what made Robinhood special, or maybe more broadly, like what does a modern capital markets infrastructure look like?
Yeah, so the former question in terms of what made Robinhood kind of special, what made it successful, the key learning I had from that is that it's never the best technology that wins. It's always the best distribution that ends up winning. And for someone that's a VC like yourself, like that's a pretty obvious insight, nothing to really write home about. But for someone that was an engineer, a new grad engineer, that was kind of like, that shattered my entire concept of how the world works. Because I had this impression that like, oh yeah, technology, like programmers are like, especially working in places like Facebook, it's like programmers are the people that are really running things, and like technology, like whoever built the best technology is the one who's going to end up winning. And the kind of customer obsession that I saw at Robinhood was, everything was kind of guided by product decisions. And I think that's absolutely the right way to be growing any kind of consumer business. And it's really interesting because in crypto, that's not how most companies work. Like most companies are completely tech driven. They're really, honestly, if you talk to a lot of companies, they don't even have like a user feedback funnel, which to me is quite bizarre. And a lot of stuff that happens in crypto, it's like these smart guys fresh out of college, they're able to raise a pretty large seed round or eventually a pretty large Series A. And they just work on these technical problems for the sake of kind of being able to work on a product and launch a token. And this kind of user feedback cycle isn't really there. So I think that was one of the most important things that I realized. And I think that's honestly why Robinhood won. Like they were really good at generating hype, like from the very beginning when they had that wait list on Hacker News all the way to like, even now, I think that the kind of approaches that they're taking are kind of building delightful products for their users. So I think that's like one really important thing. The second thing around modern capital markets is that they're extremely, extremely antiquated. That was like one of my key takeaways from how everything works from the Robinhood side. And growing up, I feel like I had this view that, oh yeah, all these things are done in a really good way. Like, for example, I used to think like doctors, everything is kind of done in a perfect way. I used to think fintech, like, oh, everything happening with the stock market must be done in a really perfect way. But as you get older, you start like understanding a lot more of how this works. In the case of doctors, I'm seeing like my friends that went to med school become doctors. And I'm like, wait a minute, these guys don't really know shit a lot of the time. And I'm like, okay, well, I guess that the way that things work in the medical world is like very, very like people have very specific skill sets and they're kind of just not really able to get involved in a lot of other issues that might come up. In the case of fintech, it's like, okay, it turns out that everything that happens behind the scenes is just a complete mess where there's a lot of manual intervention that needs to happen. There's a lot of very fragile systems that are like the way these systems are built internally end up being very fragile because they're not built with like modern technical standards in mind. They're built with standards from like the 1980s, 1990s, which by the time like 2017, 2018 comes around, it's like these systems can be built in much better ways. And there's a lot of things that really don't need to be there. Like, for example, T+2 settlement, where you have to wait 2 days for trades to settle, that really degrade how the user experience works. So I think that I don't know if the American financial system will be able to transition into using a much more modern technical stack. But I do think that the way that it's built right now is definitely hurting just customers that are trying to trade. And we saw this happening with like the entire GameStop saga at Robinhood. The GameStop saga was my impetus for starting a crypto company in the first place. And back then I used to think that like Robinhood was doing a very poor job of handling it. But in hindsight, after spending a lot more time waiting for the dust to settle, I think that a lot of it, like Robinhood did a very poor job communicating with how the GameStop saga was happening. But in terms of the actual mechanics behind it, where they owed collateral to the DTCC and like these collateral requirements were raised to $3 billion kind of overnight, those are really poorly designed systems. And I think it ends up having, like, it definitely makes it harder for brokerages that are operating, but I think it also ends up impacting users who are like no longer allowed to trade, for example. And if these systems were built on crypto rails, it would be just substantially better.
It's too kind to call them systems. It's more of like a large clump of feelings that people might share at some particular point of time. We're in a world where it's not fair to me to say, but I think is in certain parts of the tech world, it is trivial to build this correctly at this point. So that brings us to Sei. Tell us about what it is, how you got the idea, and kind of what were the first steps you took to make it happen.
Yeah, so Sei is the first parallelized EVM.
Let's unpack what is an EVM and then what is parallelized.
So an EVM stands for the Ethereum virtual machine. And the EVM is what the Ethereum layer 1 initially introduced to the market. So before Ethereum came to market, back then it was basically Bitcoin. Bitcoin was like the thing. There were a lot of other projects, but they were basically doing the same thing as Bitcoin, where you'd be able to like send and receive money, but you weren't able to do anything else. So with the Ethereum virtual machine introduced, it's this idea of a general purpose, Turing complete virtual machine to be able to write arbitrary programming logic on the blockchain. And I mean, honestly, when I first learned about this in 2017, I was like, this makes no sense to me. I don't really understand it. And I was a CS major. So it took me some time to kind of understand what that means. But basically, you can just write whatever you want to on the blockchain. And that was the key unlock that Ethereum offered. The only thing is that Ethereum was not built with scalability in mind. Like when Vitalik and all these guys were building Ethereum, they like raised money and then afterwards they were like, oh shit, we're running out of money. We need to like launch something. And they had a lot of these like grandiose ideas for how they'd be scaling Ethereum and making it more performant, but they never got around to doing that before the launch. And as a result of that, the launch happened and Ethereum was only really able to process like 50 transactions per second. 50 transactions per second is really, really low. And that's like the upper bound. What you see in practice ends up being closer to 20 transactions per second. It works fine if no one's using the chain. And you're able to write these complex smart contracts that are doing stuff when there's not much kind of demand spikes. But as soon as there's any kind of demand spike, it's like 1,000 people are trying to buy this NFT on Ethereum. How do they actually purchase something? Well, the way that their transaction is included is they need to raise gas fees a lot because that's how you're able to get your transaction prioritized. And that basically means spending more money. And the result of that is you end up seeing things like $100 transaction fees on Ethereum L1. And that's like actually pretty recent. Like that was happening, less than a year ago, like $100 to even be able to send Ethereum. So that is kind of, crazy in my perspective. And that's why we explored making the EVM higher performance. And there's different ways that you can do that. The clearest way to us was by parallelizing the EVM. So the idea of parallelization means just doing multiple things at the same time. In the context of the EVM, this basically means processing multiple transactions at the same time instead of processing them one after the other. Because initially the EVM was built in a sequential model where if you had 100 transactions coming in, they'd all be processed one after the other. The end result of that is that it takes a lot longer to process these transactions. You're not making use of modern hardware because, like, for example, this laptop that I'm recording this podcast on, it has multiple cores in it and it's able to process multiple work streams at the same time. Like, I'm able to have Spotify running at the same time that my Google Chrome is running. And what this means is, like, you have multiple cores, you're able to process multiple work streams, and it's kind of just low-hanging fruit to take the EVM and start parallelizing it by making use of the multiple cores that are already there on the hardware that this VM would be running on. So because of that, like, we started parallelizing the EVM. And yeah, I mean, I think that the other benefit you get from improving the throughput for the EVM is in a much bigger developer design space. So if you look at the market right now, most developers in crypto, they're making use of the Ethereum virtual machine for writing their smart contracts. The only other contenders really would be Solana's C-level runtime. I mean, that's honestly the only real contender. There's a few kind of long tail types of VMs right now. For example, there's Move VM, which like Sui, Aptos, Movement Labs are using, but there's very little, like, even though these projects have raised a lot of money and they've been able to get, like, their token is doing very well, there's not really much adoption on Move right now. I think it's like less than 5% of the overall market share. And then outside of that, it's like Fuel and a lot of these other ones that, in my perspective, it seems like no one is really using. So basically everyone is using the EVM right now, over like 75% of crypto developers. And similar to how JavaScript got started in the mid 1990s, and then it was able to build up this kind of mind share, and then it was incredibly difficult to replace. Like, I mean, there's been a ton of things that people have tried to build to replace JavaScript, like, for example, VB script from back in the day, and even more recently, there's like WebAssembly. But it's not really getting replaced. And the reason for JavaScript is because all the developers are tied to it, all the tooling is tied to it, all the mindshare is tied to it. It's kind of the default choice that any new grad developer, like any new person entering the industry, would use. Similarly, the EVM is kind of that thing that is the default thing with all the tooling, developers, mindshare. And that's why one of the core theses that we built up is that the EVM is here to stay. No one is going to be replacing the EVM. And as a result of that, you really want to be optimizing the EVM to enable better developer experiences. So with the current EVM right now, if you're not able to get more than like 60 transactions per second, the end result of that is developers need to build applications for users that support 60 transactions per second. Like, they can't build more complex applications. And if you look at something like trading, if you're trying to trade on NASDAQ, you need around 20,000 transactions per second that can be supported. On Ethereum right now, there's 60. So what that means is you can't really build something like NASDAQ on chain. That's why what we've noticed in crypto is you start seeing people making use of anti-patterns, like building things that are purposely simple, that don't follow whatever kind of traditional best practices are, just to get something that works on chain. One example here would be the concept of an automated market maker. Automated market makers like Uniswap, they do not exist in traditional finance because they're not capital efficient, but they exist in crypto because they're able to fit the limitations what the EVM offers. So that's why we got started parallelizing the EVM. And this basically lets you get the best of both Ethereum and Solana. You're able to get the developers, tooling, mindshare that you have with the EVM. And you're also able to get the high performance nature that you get with a chain like Solana. And I would say that the market and the community received this extremely well. We put out the announcement for the first parallelized EVM in November of 2023. After that, I mean, everyone was extremely excited about it. We went live in July of 2024 with the public kind of mainnet on that. And since then, there's just been a ton of new stuff that's deploying on Sei.
The image in my mind is always like, you've got the original Nintendo with 16 colors and a bunch of pixels, and you're trying to render PlayStation 5 video games on it, right? You just can't. You don't have as much memory. You don't have enough throughput. You can't make it happen. And so there are a number of approaches to making protocols more capable of doing what they're meant to do, which is support financial infrastructure, payments, and so on. And one of these approaches is parallelization. Can you talk a little bit, not in full technical detail, but in an abstract way, perhaps, about what are the trade-offs when you introduce parallelization? Like, a lot of the Ethereum people say that the trade-offs are too expensive and you can't do what you're describing. So by what magic trick are you able to create this new architecture?
I think one big aspect of it is it's technically difficult, and most other projects are not really willing to take the risk of like changing that architecture. In Ethereum's case, they already have this project that has been around for several years now, and it's really risky to kind of re-architect the entire system. There's I want to say hundreds of billions of dollars of assets on Ethereum right now. So it's just introducing a ton of risk to try to change a system that in some ways in Ethereum's case is already good enough. Now, from more of a technical side, there's two issues that come up, and I'll keep this kind of higher level. The first issue is state bloat. And the core idea there is if you're processing more transactions, there's more data that you need to store. And that's in and of itself an extremely hard technical problem to deal with. And I can elaborate on that if you're curious, but we figured out a way to address that other chains really haven't been able to. And then the second issue is just tied to hardware requirements. If you want to have this high performance chain, then you ideally want to be running higher performance hardware to be able to get just more transactions per second that you're able to squeeze out of the chain. And that's kind of a philosophical decision that differentiates us from a chain like Ethereum. In the case of Ethereum, they want people to be able to run a Raspberry Pi to validate the blockchain. We don't think that's the direction the industry is moving in. We don't think that's the best for user experiences. So we have different kind of node requirements. And our node requirements are much more similar to what you see in the rest of the industry. For example, like with Solana, Aptos, we like similar node requirements to other modern blockchains.
There is a trade-off, end of the day, that you have to abide by. And in this case, the hardware has to be quite specialized. What does it take to run a node, and what kind of entities are able to do so?
You can run a node on a beefy laptop. So it's not actually that specialized. I think that people have this idea that you need GPUs and all this custom stuff built out. No, you could just start running it on your laptop, or if you have a beefier machine, or you could just get an EC2 instance on AWS or something similar on some cloud provider. So honestly, it's very accessible for people to run validators in full nodes if they want to.
I remember when Sei was just coming out, quite a bit of the reputation of the chain and the project was around being purpose-built for capital markets. And obviously, we've talked about your Robinhood background and your comments on whether the capital markets are fit for purpose. How did you approach go-to-market and approach your positioning? And then, what's the relationship that you have to the financial services industry?
Yeah, so the first part of, I guess, what you're asking before around who's running a validator, who's running full nodes. Validators are being run by just, I guess, specialized validator providers. So basically the people that are the most legit validator service providers in the industry, they're all running validators on Sei right now. So it's people that know exactly what they're doing. In terms of our initial go-to-market and in terms of how Sei is going to be kind of growing and also the relationship with the financial services industry, the first part is that it's extremely scrappy in terms of getting a layer one blockchain built. A layer one is like a multi-dimensional market problem in a way because you have to build a core technology, but then you also need to get developers to start making use of that technology. But then on the other hand, you also need normal community members to come onto the blockchain. And it very much is like a chicken and egg problem where developers don't want to come until there's community members already. Community members don't want to come until there's cool apps to be building, which developers need to build. So getting that right is extremely difficult. And that's why building a layer one blockchain is the hardest problem in crypto. It's extremely technically complex, but it's also extremely complex from a go-to-market standpoint. And in a way, that's also why the upside is so high if you're able to do it right. Projects like Bitcoin, Ethereum, the reason their market caps are so high is because they've been able to get that kind of chicken and egg problem solved. In our case, the way that we got started was just being very focused on understanding what the core set of developers would be that would benefit from this and really supporting them in getting applications built at the start. And now that we're bigger, I think the foundation, so there's a Sei Labs, which I'm leading, which is responsible for R&D and building the core technology. Then there's the Sei Foundation, which is responsible much more for helping grow the ecosystem. And the approach that Sei Foundation is taking right now very much is a approach that doesn't scale, which is building one-on-one relationships with a lot of these founders, understanding their needs, their pain points, and then supporting them through the entire process of getting something started on Sei. So this would be from the ideation process to the product building process to the fundraising process, and then eventually on the launch process. So it very much is building these relationships and then helping them succeed. And I think right now we have a relatively large ecosystem. I think there's still a pretty large delta between an ecosystem like ours and an ecosystem like Solana, for example, where there are several killer applications that have been deployed. And the way to kind of become that Solana level chain is by focusing very deeply on building these killer applications. So supporting developers in building something like a pump.fun or a poly market, or now something like virtuals on base, understanding like what trends are happening in the industry and supporting these developers in really being able to launch these products like as early in that kind of the life cycle for that vertical as you can. And the last part of your question around financial services. So there's a lot of market makers and financial services players that are investors in Sei Labs. I think long term, the way that this will play out is that they will start coming on chain once it's both safe from a regulatory standpoint for them to do so, and it's profitable from a financial standpoint to do so. I think that's why a lot of financial services players haven't really come on chain quite yet. They might just be trading assets like Bitcoin and Ethereum because it's safe for them to do that from their balance sheets. But coming on chain, I mean, it's a big technical lift. And if there's not as much upside to be gained from doing that, they won't be coming on chain. So I think the way it'll play out in the next few years is once there's clear regulation defined by the government, that will result in a lot more developers, investors coming back into crypto. And I think it'll also result in these sophisticated financial players that'll start experimenting with like having on-chain smart contracts or building their own custom blockchains. I don't necessarily think it'll be like the American government or like US traditional financial kind of rails, like, for example, how like trade settle, that'll immediately come on chain. I think it'll start off by being stuff like stablecoin payments that ends up getting the most utilization, at least in the United States. And then gradually we'll start seeing more and more stuff start coming onto the blockchain.
Got it. So just to anchor our listeners in terms of the scale, right? At the time of this recording, Sei has a market cap of around 1.5 billion and a fully diluted value of around 3.5 billion. So it's a large project, about 200 million or so worth of capital that's locked into the various DeFi protocols, or what, in the old world we'd call AUM. It's hard to get to the point where you are, and especially doing that ecosystem development and kind of, it's really hand-to-hand combat to get applications to build on your protocol, because it's kind of like, between the iOS app store and the Android app store, the app stores are competing for the best applications to build there first because they have the most users, and you've already described the sort of chicken egg problem. If you look across the competitive landscape today, which is, other chains, high performance chains, modular chains, roll-ups, Arbitrum, Monad, Mega ETH, and sort of things that people expect will exist, things that already exist. I think there's just a lot of confusion about the splintering of the Ethereum world into all of these chains. How do you see, from the perspective of Sei Labs, like how you compete against all of these other players? And then more broadly, how does the Web3 world come back together where this is less zero sum and more collaborative between all the different chains?
Yeah. So first of all, in terms of competition, it's entirely about getting killer applications to deploy on Sei. If we're able to get multiple killer applications, then it doesn't really matter what kind of technical innovation other chains are doing. The only thing that matters is how you're able to get distribution, and that fundamentally is distribution. So whichever chains end up winning are going to be the ones that have these killer apps getting built. Now, I think the biggest two differentiators over there will be the execution environment. So EVM versus like MoveVM, SVM, whatever else. And the second thing will be performance, how much scale you're able to support. I think those two things matter a lot for developers. A lot of other stuff, at least based off conversations we've had, tends to be a lot kind of fluffier in a way and doesn't really mean much for developers. So I think whichever chain is going to win, like it needs to support the EVM, and it also needs to be extremely high performance. And that's why a lot of these like alt VM type chains, I think it's going to be much harder for them to succeed than it would have been if they'd gotten started with the EVM. That's my first thought over there. The second thought in terms of kind of Ethereum fragmentation, it's really been interesting, especially over the past week, to see how, so for listeners, when at the time of this recording, the Trump meme coin launched around, I guess, 6 days ago. And after that, there's just been this entire reaction from the Ethereum kind of community where oh, why did this launch on Solana? Why didn't this launch on Ethereum? And it definitely is bringing to light right now that the Ethereum ecosystem has problems, both in terms of setting direction, in terms of go-to-market, and in terms of just having some kind of leadership structure that people are satisfied with. What I anticipate happening there is there will need to be some kind of leadership clarity. And I think Vitalik is pushing for this to really improve a lot of the processes from the Ethereum Foundation side. I don't think Ethereum is going anywhere. I mean, it's the second biggest project in existence, and I think they will be able to fix a lot of the problems that they have right now. And in terms of how things in the longer term will be playing out, first of all, I think that crypto is winner take most. So in terms of these blockchains, there might be 100 blockchains that people create. Out of them, there will be 5 that are really able to get any kind of significant market share. The other 95 will just be kind of existing, but not really used by too many people. So you basically need to figure out who these 5 winners are. These 5 winners are going to be completely redefining the way several industries work. I think finance will be the most lucrative part of this, but there will be other industries that they redefine as well. So I think there's a ton of impact you can have by figuring out which, from these chain standpoint, they'll be having a ton of impact. From an investor standpoint, if you figure out who these 5 chains are, I think their returns are going to be extremely high just because of the amount of infrastructure that'll be replaced by these chains in sectors like finance. And I also think that in terms of how this will play out from when it stops becoming zero sum, one way to think about it right now is the pie is so small that focusing too much on how you are positioned against these other chains isn't really the best use of time. The best use of time is to just get killer applications to come and build on your chain. Then you're going to that's the thing that matters, to just focus on that. And then as more regulation comes out for crypto, as people become more comfortable with the idea of crypto, as there's more use cases, more people will come on chain anyway. And I think that's when you'll start seeing it become less of a zero sum game and more of a positive sum game.
It's definitely easier to be in a positive sum game when everybody's growing instead of doing the roller coaster of Clown Town, which is what sometimes things feel like. Okay, last question. If you look at your social accounts now, you guys are hiring for head of DeepIn, head of AI, head of decentralized science, which signals to me that you're thinking about finding those next waves of attention that require a high performance chain. Can you talk about what you think are the biggest levers for the types of applications you want? Who do you want to come to Sei in the next year, in the next 2 years? And where do you think those pockets of growth are going to be?
Yeah, so in terms of who you want coming to Sei from more of the developer standpoint, there's a persona for a founder that we found to be really strong. And then there's the type of application they're going to be building. In terms of the persona, we found what we called internally as failed founders to actually be the best fit. So if you think about it, the people that are going to be best at building a startup are the people that have already built a startup already. There's the successful founders who've already, successful founders are probably still working on their company. So it's really difficult to get them to leave and start building on Sei. But then there's other people that are really talented founders, but they just weren't able to get lucky in the right ways. And they end up having a lot of the grit, determination, kind of mental acuity you're looking for. And they've already been through the cycle as well. So first of all, they know that they want to be founders. And secondly, they've already learned a lot from that process. So I think those folks end up being the most effective people from the get-go. But it's not like college kids from hackathons. It's not like people leaving their job at Google that are trying to start a company for the first time. It's these founders that haven't really found much traction before that I think are the sweet spot. In terms of the types of applications, I think what really moves the needle in the short term is an application that does have some kind of candidly speculative aspect to it. That is the thing in crypto that has, in my opinion, the highest kind of chance of having very fast growth. And if you look at it in Web 2, I think it ends up being tied to some kind of cardinal sin. For example, greed is definitely one part of it, which is why Robinhood succeeded. And then there's stuff tied to social standing, which is why applications like Facebook and LinkedIn succeeded. And I think that certain things are much better on chain. And I think stuff tied to finance definitely kind of fits that description where you have like parties that don't trust each other that are able to do things in a trustless kind of way. So I think something tied to speculation will definitely take off. What I want to start seeing happening after, though, and I think that's why the foundation is hiring for things like head of AI, head of DeepIn, is more broader types of industries that start building on Sei. And right now, it does seem like DeepIn, AI, decentralized science, industries like this are still pretty early outside of like what we've seen with DeFi and trading. And these industries are industries that have the potential to be extremely massive. And they all benefit from having higher throughput. Like in the case of AI agents, for example, if you're constrained to like a 20 transaction per second environment, then you cannot really have agent to agent interaction happening, at least not in a seamless way. Whereas if you're suddenly at like a 5 gigagas, so like 250,000 transaction per second environment, it's much easier to support all these random interactions that like AI agents would want to do. In the case of DeepIn, it's much easier to support hundreds of thousands or millions of people that are running physical hardware and then having transactions getting submitted on chain. So I think we are seeing certain types of industries that are going to do really well from higher performance. And that's why the foundation is focusing on those industries for kind of long-term bets, basically, to see whether those experiments, those industries will be able to grow on, Sei.
This is certainly going to be a very fast-paced year, and we'll see a lot of change. But I'm excited to hear the longer-term plan, because I do think people can always say that we're early, but we are. The adoption from an industry perspective is still quite low, and technology in many ways is still quite janky, but that is also the exciting part, and I think why we're all here. Jay, if people want to learn more about you or about Sei, where should they go?
Yeah, so Twitter's the best spot to get in touch. My Twitter handle is Jayendra, so Jayendra _Jog, Jog. So just shoot me a DM and I'll be happy to chat.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me on, man.
Hi, everyone. That's it for this week's episode of the FinTech Blueprint. For more technical deep dives into all things fintech and decentralized finance, check out fintechblueprint.com and grab a free subscription to the newsletter. This is Lex, and I'll see you next time.